of all of the research that has been funded related to education, only 1% has focused on how dollars are raised and how they're allocated. So we're studying everything that people are spending money on, but we're not studying the fundamental premise of where are we getting our money from? And like that to me is pretty baffling.
Welcome to Always Learning, where curiosity never retires and knowledge is always in session. I'm Christopher Stewart, here to explore the boundless possibilities of education with you, from innovative schools to lifelong learning. Let's challenge the conventional wisdom and ignite a passion for discovery. Let's have some fresher conversations about education. Are you ready? Are you curious? Sure. Good, then let's learn together. My guest today is the worldwide legend in the world of of education research. My guest today is Rebecca Sibilia, who's the executive director of EdFund. Before starting this work with EdFund, she had multiple other projects, one of which I still use today as part of my World Fund of Information when I argue with people on Twitter. And that was the work that EdBuild did to figure out how funding differs from district to district. Even districts that are contiguous with each other could have very different outcomes in their funding. And, that makes a difference. And Rebecca, stop me if I say anything like inaccurate, but I think the biggest bullet point I took away from that, I like to take away one big takeaway from things, which is that there's like a couple of $1 billion more spent on kids that are in primarily white districts than kids that are in primary Black districts. So when people talk about structural discrimination and structural issues that create discriminatory outcomes, there's one. That's a pretty big one. If you spend a couple billion more. So first of all, welcome to the show, Rebecca. And then two, correct me if I said that wrong. Like, is it a couple of billion more?
It's 23 billion more.
It's 23 billion.
And so I actually think that that's like 3 or 4 times the size of Title I right now.
Wow.
So if you were to triple Title I, you would get really close to closing that $23 billion gap, which is what the current president was trying to do and probably will not see accomplished in this current Congress. But yeah, 23 billion, it's a big number. It's about $2,000 per kid. When you think about that in a classroom of 20, that's $40,000 more that you could be paying that teacher.
Wow. So you fixed that problem, and that's what made you move on to the next problem.
Well, we actually just gave you maps so that you could fight on Twitter. And so now that everyone's fighting on Twitter, just because of EdBuild, obviously, now we can move on to another.
So that was EdBuild, and now your new organization is EdFund, and people can find it. Is it ed-fund.org, right?
It is, yes.
So they can find you there. I think in this new work, you are looking at how research could inform policy more than it's informing policy right now. Let's just start there. What's the critical problem? We have research. It supposedly tells us that, is there a consensus on what school finance and school reform does in terms of outcomes? Is there a consensus?
I believe that we are very close to a consensus that money does matter. Well, let me say this. I think that there is whole consensus that money matters. I think that there are still some skeptics out there that are questioning whether or not the weight of just providing dollars can offset how those dollars are spent. But what we tended to see in the ESSER times is that when folks get an extra dollar, they usually put it into human capital. And the Rick Hanusheks and the more conservative economists of the world will tell you, an effective teacher, spending on an effective teacher is much more important than just spending $1. But they're both right. If when school districts get extra money, they spend it on personnel and trying to get the most effective personnel, then I think that we can say that we have come to consensus. Extra money does make an impact. And schools, frankly, school districts know how to spend it in order to benefit kids.
There's a couple of different ways, I think, to unpack this. One way is that we should talk about the skeptics, or what is that issue for the people that aren't 100% agreeing on this. Two, why it's important. Like, why should we even talk about this? It's clearly one of the least sexy issues in education. I mean, like the culture wars and books that are banned and stuff like that is just way easier to get involved with, because that stuff is like WWE. It's like fighting. But then you say, hey, can we talk about school finance? I can't think of anything that's more like a sine qua non, meaning without this, no other thing exists, right? Like within education. That is less talked about though, right? Like it's not going to be on the nightly news tonight. Here's some major issues. I just want to say, and trying to make things simple for myself, that I saw in some of the studies that I had ahead of time. And I do have citations for these, by the way, just so people, if they want to test me. The major issues in school finance include equity, ensuring that all students have access to a quality education, adequacy, providing enough funding to schools so that they can provide a quality education, efficiency, ensuring that schools are using their resources effectively and efficiently, transparency, making sure that the public has access to the information so that they can see how the funds are being spent, and accountability, holding schools accountable for the results they achieve with their students. Does that sound about like a simple rundown of what's at issue?
Yes. And if you were to say that we're going to craft a system that has all five of those included, we would be all singing Kumbaya and happy around the campfire and ready to move on to the culture war.
Well, what's that issue? What's the problem? I mean, we've got a 200-year, 150-year-old education system. You would think we would have some of this worked out and really thought through by now. So what's the problem?
So we've been spending a whole lot of time debating this ethereal question of like, does money matter? Right. And for the past 40 or 50 years, that's been what researchers have been focused on, the question of does money matter? But the problem is that we live in a limited resource environment. So like there's only so many dollars that states can raise, right? So the real question is not whether or not money matters. I think that that's an important question where the science is starting to get settled. But we're never going to get to better systems unless we recognize that we're living within a constrained resource environment. So the questions of for whom, on what, from where matter a whole lot. And we have very little research to tell us what works at that step down level in terms of crafting policy.
To the extent that you have research that says funding does matter, how's that claim made? When, there's something a couple of days ago that I read and tweeted about that was basically saying only 26% of educational interventions show positive signs, right? Like out of all the money that government spent on interventions, 26% actually showed positive results. So that's very humbling. So it makes us think like whatever you think you're about to push as the issue, just be prepared for 5 years from now for somebody to say, nope, we studied it, it doesn't work. Um, how are we so sure about this particular intervention, like providing more funds for schools?
So I think that we have several studies that have now looked at decades and decades of interventions related to school finance, going all the way back to like the early 70s, when courts were ruling that there was more money that needed to be put into the school finance system to either equalize or provide adequate resources. And what they found is that over time, that effect was pretty consistent. And it had a positive effect on students. And so I do think that like, if, this is not something where we're just now experimenting with funding schools, we're experimenting with different ways of funding schools, which is frankly all the more reason why we need research to align with kind of what's happening in reality rather than this kind of theoretical question that doesn't help state legislators every year.
You just mentioned it. So going back to the 1960s, like with the Coleman Report and other things, those really were a call for not just more money, but equalized funding. And in some cases, I think compensatory money. Like it doesn't even just have to be equal. In some cases, it has to be more for certain kinds of kids and certain kinds of districts. Is the real pushback on this the idea that you keep mentioning about the constraints? We only have so much money, and education is not necessarily. Well, listen, education is 40% of Minnesota's budget, my state's budget, 40%. It's pretty hard to make a case that we're not spending enough on education. Now, we're not getting exactly world leading outcomes for that money, but is that the main pushback, is that we only have so much money? Like we can
Yeah,
fight
I mean, I could
wars,
speak.
but
So there are two kind of fundamental factors here. So the first is, yes, state budgets as a whole only have so much money and they need to make priorities. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that half of the money that's powering schools comes from local taxpayers.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so if we don't have the right policies in place that kind of where states are going to regulate that side of the equation, then we end up in a system where low income communities may be overtaxing themselves compared to their wealthier peers just to pay for their education. And so if you have a family that's paying higher taxes in order to send their kids to an equally funded school, have you really fixed the system? I would argue that you haven't. Ask me what the property tax rates are for every school district in Minnesota, and it would probably take me about 3 years to answer that question accurately, Chris. And that's what I mean about the kind of real world research that we need to start focusing on.
Now, I don't want to pull the kind of like local, we're better than everybody, woebegone thing, but I will say this. Minnesota had this thing a while ago called the Minnesota Miracle. And it was about the change in financial or school finance funding, the way that it was done. And it was no longer done just by tax base. It was done by need. So if you are in poor schools, you get more money. If you have more kids with special education, you get more money. So actually, it's kind of the inverse of a lot of places.
Mhm.
If you have a school that has few of the kids that need additional services or whatever, you actually get less money. In Minnesota, we're woebegone. We are just better than you.
But let me answer, let me counter that.
Yeah.
Almost every state actually does have a formula that looks like that on paper, where if you were to just look at the state's calculations, they're sending more money to low income school districts, they're sending more money for districts that are serving a high proportion of special education students, English language learners, et cetera. The problem with that equation, though, is that if the state isn't doing something about local taxes, then you end up spinning into a completely arbitrary system because the state could be sending more money to a low income community, but a wealthy community is just out raising property taxes on them. They end up benefiting anyway. And so that's where I start to kind of get into and take issue with some of the stipulations that because on average in the US, low income kids are now getting just about as much money as higher wealth peers, that we fixed the problem, right? You can have a paradoxical statement. You can say that there is an outcome that is good, but it didn't come from an intended policy. So I'm going to give you an example. Um, if we had a classroom where a third of kids were proficient, a third of kids were testing basic, and a third of kids were below basic, would we say that that is a successful classroom?
No.
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 We certainly would not, right? And we would
Right.
certainly wonder, like, what's happening in that classroom where we have such stratified results?
Yeah.
But if you were to look at the average in that classroom, on average, the kids are doing fine, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so when we talk about these economic theories of like stratification or regressing to the mean, what we're talking about is that when we talk about averages in terms of outcomes, we're hiding a whole lot of volatility and difference that's happening in terms of school funding on a district by district, student by student basis.
How are you able to get your hands on the handlebars of an issue like this when there's so much variability from state to state and even within states? You have 50 states. I don't know if this is true or not. What I'm saying, you can correct me. It feels like that would be 50 different funding schemes or 50 different kind of worldviews, or I don't know what to call it. It just seems like there would be so much variability. It'd be hard to find the handlebars on an issue like this and really drive it. Are they more like than I'm thinking? And it's easier to like, pull them together and get the research?
The answer is kind of yes and no. The answer is yes and no. There is a similar structure that almost every state employs when they're calculating how much funding students should get. They do that allocation side. So they say, how many kids are you serving? And then they'll calculate either based on student need or based on the expected operating model of that school. So it's either a student-based formula or a resource-based formula. But they calculate how much every school district needs in order to operate. They come up with this magic answer that almost always is arbitrary. I could talk about that forever, but I will move on. So they come up with this magic number for every school district. And then they subtract from that what we call a local expected contribution. So what does the state think that the locals should contribute to their schools based on their wealth? and then they send the difference. That's how it works in every state, almost every state. And so there's a whole lot of questions within that structure that we can actually be interrogating from a theoretical perspective that doesn't require us to nuance it to death, right? So, for example, across the country, when states are deducting how much they think locals should contribute, how close do they get to what locals are actually raising? How close do they get to the actual wealth of that community rather than their expected or projected wealth of that community? You can inquire about that in 48 out of 50 states and get a sense of which states are doing it well and which states aren't. It's the same research question.
Are the states sharing information with each other on this? Is this even a topic of discussion for them, or is this kind of a thing that is like a third rail? They don't really want to talk about it much.
No, and I think that this happens with all policy, but most state legislators will say that their state funding formula is highly unique. Nobody else does it like they do it. And it's hard to kind of get into the fact that as a general construct, everyone's kind of doing it the same. Where you get into real variability is on the local tax side. So once that formula actually falls out, what can the locals do in order to supplement funding for their schools? That's where the 50 states start to really dramatically diverge in terms of their approach. For the most part, it's tough to tell a legislator that they're not a special snowflake, but they're not a special snowflake.
Except for Minnesota.
Except for Minnesota.
Except for Minnesota. I want to ask you a few kind of really elementary questions here. These are going to be super elementary, but it makes it accessible for me because I don't live in this. So years ago in Minnesota, when Jesse Ventura was was governor, who's one of our best
I don't know if that was wishful thinking or not.
Yeah, that was wishful thinking. When Jesse was governor, he proposed that the state take over the entire obligation of school finance and funding, so it just be a state obligation. So just the simplest question I could think about that: why isn't it a state obligation? Most state constitutions have in their constitution something about it's our job to produce an equal or adequate, or in Minnesota, it's a uniform system of, how can you have that in your constitution and not just have it be a state burden without all the local stuff?
Chris, that is a fantastic question.
That's an elementary question.
So this is actually, when we look at the history of school funding, where everything started. So I like to say that we're kind of in the third or fourth wave of the concept of school funding. Where things started with the Coleman Report in the 60s was the federal government should create this galactic funding formula so that every kid, no matter where they live in the United States, can get equal access to education. And we litigated that a few times in the Supreme Court in various different ways. And the Supreme Court said there is no federal constitutional right to an education. So there goes the federal government. Federal government can't step in and do anything related to school funding. Okay. In terms of regulation. So then advocates took it to the states and they were like, funding based on local wealth creates an inherently inequitable system. And in almost all states, the courts ruled, yes, it does. Instead of saying, so we shouldn't fund based on a hyper-local system, they said, so the state should fill in the holes. They should fill in the gap. And what we know is that states don't do a very good job of filling in the gap when a system can work on its own, right? So you set up a situation where you haven't really remedied the problem. You're just ordering that states consistently find a solution to fix a broken system without reaching into the broken system. So my answer would be we shouldn't have a funding system that is highly localized. And several states have actually gone to state-funded models. And we do tend to see more equitable outcomes in terms of how those resources are distributed.
What kind of, so not to put you on the spot, well, what's a state that's an example of that has done that?
So Vermont's actually a really interesting example.
Oh, good.
Wyoming is an interesting example too. So here's what I'm going to tell you about that. And I'm going to be honest with you because you keep it real with me, so I'm going to keep it real with you.
Thank you.
It appears as if it's a lot easier to share your local taxes when all of the kids that you're sharing your money with are white.
When you said Vermont, I was
Um,
like, yeah, Vermont is not the most diverse place in the world.
yes.
Yeah.
And neither is
Mhm.
Wyoming.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
there's federal tribe stuff out there that's handled completely differently. But on the whole, what we found is that when states have moved to state funded systems, they tend to be much more racially homogenous than states where
Mhm.
this is debated year after year and nothing ever moves forward.
That's a crazy observation.
It's not
That's a real,
crazy.
I should say, let me choose a different word. That's a daunting uh,
Mhm.
observation. And again, well, like I said earlier, that challenges the people who really don't believe that discrimination can be structural or that it still is. They think we have the same kind of rules that we're all playing by, but the structures aren't the same and they're not producing the same results. So I feel like I got ahead of myself and started asking questions about many other things, but I do want to go back to the premise of your new organization. Like you have a stat in here somewhere that like only 1% of funding goes to research. I might be saying that wrong, but
Yeah.
1%? I mean, there are times where I go to the government site and it feels like there's a lot of research there. Are you guys saying that finance research or just research in general?
So, of all of the research that has been funded related to education, only 1% has focused on how dollars are raised and how they're allocated. So, we're studying everything that people are spending money on, but
Hmm.
we're not
Hmm.
studying the fundamental premise of where are we getting our money from. And like that to me is pretty baffling. And so it creates this general perspective that I think that you'll agree most folks in the education community just kind of feel like, well, the money is manna from heaven. We don't really care how it's calculated. Once it gets to us, we really care about how it's spent. Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you really have to take a step back and look at things like maps and those sorts of things that EdBuild was trying to kind of permeate the public culture with for folks to really start to challenge the notion that like this wasn't a system created by, some superior being. This was a system that was actually intentionally created by a number of overlapping factors, including housing and segregation, et cetera, that is perpetuating itself into inequitable outcomes. And so the idea that this is the single largest investment that we make in children in the United States, and only 1% of the money that we're spending to study what works for them is going to how the money is actually being allocated seems kind of crazy to me.
A
I can't
cynical
tell you that
question.
like EdFund is going to be able to substantially change that. We're a small nonprofit, but
You
we're
better change
hoping
it.
to set pace.
So another kind of like cynical question around this is maybe you don't study this or maybe you don't want to change it because I can't think of a more politically dumb thing to do than to challenge the boundaries that are providing advantages for people that are the people that vote the most. So, like, if I wanted to go changing the boundaries of a school district, for instance, that has a high tax base and great houses and all that stuff, and the people move there for that, man, that's the quickest way to get voted out of like a state rep seat is to
Mm,
represent some area where you change the school boundaries. And now all of a sudden, the rich people have to go to school with the unwashed. That's my cynical kind of take on why you would never want to touch school boundaries, school finance schemes that are providing advantages to some.
mm,
And the advantages, the people that they're providing advantages to are politically active people. Like they vote,
yeah.
they pay attention. Am I being too cynical? Or is that like a good reason why you wouldn't want to touch any of this stuff?
There are two different avenues that through which we can take in order to affect change as it relates to the way we're funding schools. We can go through the legislature or we can go through the courts. So
Mm.
I have definitely gotten to a place where I don't believe that the system is structured in a way where we're ever going to get the balance of power in the legislature to make real changes to borders, or frankly, just the local nature of funding, because it is a system that biases wealthy and white districts. One of the findings in that 23 billion study that we did at EdBuild that was kind of hidden but very important is that for every one predominantly non-white district, or a district that's serving predominantly students of color, there are 6 predominantly white school districts, even though they serve the same number of kids. So when you think about how that plays out in special interests in the capital, your state superintendent's association is representing 6 superintendents that care about the interests of predominantly white kids, compared to every one superintendent who cares about the interests of predominantly non-white kids, and so on. And so the power balance, I mean, even when you get to like senators are going to have 6 times as many predominantly white school districts than those of color. And so you're never going to get to a power balance where that fracturing of society is ever going to work in advantage of those that have been, I guess, what we would say, packed and cracked, right? As it relates to gerrymandering. But that's not to say that the courts aren't a powerful tool. And I'm actually really excited about a new initiative that's coming up called Brown's Promise. And they're trying to think about a 4th wave of litigation. And what they really want to inquire is, why does a state like New Jersey need 600 school districts to serve about the same number of kids as Maryland, who's got 24? That seems like an inherently inequitable system. And we should be asking the courts in New Jersey why they're upholding a system that looks like that. And so the idea that we can move litigation at the state level that challenges the nature of boundaries and local funding, et cetera, to me is our 4th wave. It is where we need to go for the future. And there are folks that are starting to align to go there. So I'm very excited about that.
I was looking at Brown's Promise. This is great, actually. It looks like that's going to be a great initiative. One fatal flaw, though. You have to tell white people what they're going to get. Just literally have to tell them what's the benefit for them.
I was just going to say that the problem is that even after you get a positive court ruling, the legislature still has to do it. So the courts could say, as we're kind of looking at in New Jersey right now, that this system of boundaries is kind of really messed up. So you guys need to just go fix it. You can't keep these boundaries anymore. You have to have more objective boundaries. So you need folks who are going to come in with solutions once you get that positive court finding. What we're hoping to do in that ecosystem is have some real practical research to tell us where we should head when we get the opportunity to restructure what local funding and funding formulas look like.
So, Rebecca, let's keep it real. Let's just be honest here. Keep it real. I've had a political shift in my life over the last couple of years. And in a previous life, I would have said to you, like when you just said New Jersey, it would have been triggering for me because I would have said to you back then, New Jersey is a great example of providing a lot more money and the outcomes not getting a lot better, right? So New Jersey, I think, is the most expensive formula in the country. I want to say it's like 22 or 23. It's some big number. I think ours might be 12 in my state or 14, something like that. So that came out
Average
of the
per
courts.
pupil spending is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm saying. You help me to know what I'm saying. But
all of the Northeast states kind of vie for that. So it's like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey every year. Those are who's vying.
Well, and this is my loose fitting. In my previous politics, I would have said to you, like, that came out of the courts for one. There was a big case in New Jersey. The result of that case was that they got a lot more money into the schools. And the result of that lot more money in the schools is we still can talk about New Jersey as being very uneven in their student outcomes, even with like a nation leading amount of money. Now, my politics aren't the same. So I'm only saying that to you now so we can just unpack it a little bit and have you respond to it, even though I'm kind of new to agreeing with you. so help me. so so what would have been wrong about what I said before? Like if I would have said this to you before, what would have been wrong with that?
So there's two things that I would say are wrong with it. The first is that although New Jersey's funding formula pumps a lot of money into a place like Camden, for instance, right? There are over 30 school districts within a 5-mile radius of Camden. And there's a reason that there are over 30 school districts within a busing range of Camden. And I said the word that would probably trigger why those districts exist, right? All of those districts are much wealthier because they're Philadelphia suburbs, they're Camden suburbs, right? So this is where wealthy folks who live and work in Philadelphia, believe it or not, some people choose to live in New Jersey, even if they work outside of the state. They're actually outraising what Camden gets in some cases, or they're paying a whole lot less in taxes than Camden residents are in order to just try to get that competitive edge. Why that matters, why I care about the school districts that are within a certain radius is because we're talking about a teacher workforce. And ultimately, if 60 to 80% of what you're spending in schools is salaries, then that is what we know is going to matter in terms of what we're spending money on. If we know that effective teachers are the most important thing for student outcomes, then you need your most effective teachers in your lowest income communities. The teaching conditions there are much harder than they are in the leafy suburbs. And so those communities fundamentally need more money in order to attract and retain the highest quality teachers. Because teachers, believe it or not, like the rest of us, are probably going to go where the money is. And so when we talk about equity in terms of providing more money to low-income communities, in almost all circumstances, it is in order to get and keep a higher quality of teacher.
I do not want to touch this and go on this tangent because you'll have me talking for hours because it's one of my trigger spots. But I did spend a little time looking at teacher salaries as being the one way in which you can smuggle money into richer schools. If you don't look at teacher salaries and how they're distributed in districts, especially amongst poor schools and richer schools, you will be ignoring the fact that when you have high turnover in some schools, but a high level of retention in another school, that changes the cost of the teacher. So each teacher is more expensive when you have retention. So in the leafy schools that you talked about, where they have teachers that have like average tenures of like 20 years or something like that, all of their teachers are more expensive, but they're paying the same rate for their teacher that the poorest school is paying for all their 2-year teachers that they have. Like, it's such a crazy formula. Totally different discussion, but I do want to jump to, not everybody agrees with you, Rebecca. So the Fordham people put out a study, and it challenges a lot of the strongest convictions of people who think that money matters. So I have probably 5 things that I was able to pull out. I'll just quickly, I'll try and run through them. So the first one is that school finance reforms and federal funding have largely equalized funding, making it generally progressive within the states. So that's just a point around, the problem's fixed. Like, I don't know why you're here, Rebecca. The problem's already been fixed. School finance reforms have been largely equalized funding. Maybe I won't go through them all. Let me just stop on that one first.
Yeah,
I
let's
think
stop
that's
there.
the biggest
Let's
one.
tackle that one.
Yeah.
So I started to get to this with my classroom example of if you have a third of kids that are advanced, a third of kids who are proficient, a third of kids who are basic or below basic, you wouldn't call that a successful classroom. We have a funding system that is full of peaks, hills, and valleys. And so when you get to an average effect, what you're hiding is massive differences amongst some school districts that may look exactly the same. And so I'll give you an example of New York. New York City kids get about, over $30,000 per kid. But all of the other districts in New York who serve exactly the same number of students in poverty are getting about $10,000 less. Do we care about those kids less in a system where we're supposed to be attempting to equalize things? So if I were to tell you that those districts get 20,000, the state average is 25,000, New York gets 30,000. what you'll say is we've still got a whole lot of low-income kids who are $5,000 behind the state average. But because we've got one big district that's $5,000 above the state average, things start to even out. My issue is, again, that you can have an outcome that comes from chaos that actually averages out to be about the same thing. And this is actually an economic theory of things will regress to the mean. So if you have 20 students and they are all taking a quiz on something that they know nothing about, so they guess every single question, it's multiple choice. You're going to have some kids that get 100%. You're going to have some kids that get 0, right? But most are going to be somewhere in the middle because that's what probability tells us. So whenever you have a system that is built on complete chaos, on no function or forethought, you're going to regress to the mean. And so what I would argue is that saying that things are average for kids across the country can either mean everyone's getting the same amount of money, or things are averaging or regressing to the mean out of chaos. And my argument is that it is much more the latter than it is the former. The study that you cited and the study that Fordham uses was actually conducted by the co-chair of our new organization, EdFund. His name is Julian LaFortune. One of the things that is hidden in the appendices of this study, which is why it's always important to read the appendices, is that while the court-ordered reforms sent more money to the lowest quintile of school districts by wealth, so it sent more money to the lowest income communities, it did not make a substantial change for low-income kids. Why
How's
is
that possible? Yeah, how's that possible?
Because there are just as many low-income kids living in the high wealth quintiles as there are in that lowest wealth quintile. Okay.
Meaning that wealthier districts have poor kids too? Is that kind of like what you're saying? Okay.
And so if you have a system that biases wealthy communities, the poor kids in those wealthy communities are going to benefit from that bias. And that's all stuff that's sitting in that averaging that's happening in this research that Fordham is studying.
So this is a moment where I get to pretend like I'm smart. Because first of all, that's the reason.
You
That's
are,
the problem.
first of all, you are smart.
Yeah. So Rebecca, this is the problem with your issue is you have to be smart to understand it. But what you just said makes me trigger, oh, I can be smart here for a second. So when I was studying integration a long time ago, this was something that actually, you know how you read something and you have to read it twice. And the stat that I remember from reading that long ago was that 2/3 of poor white kids are in schools where they're the minority of economic minority. So 2/3 of poor white kids are going to middle class schools. 2/3 of poor Black and brown kids are going to schools where the majority of the kids are poor. So if you're poor and white, you are going to schools, like you just said, wealthy school districts do have poor kids a lot of times. A lot of times those are poor white kids who are getting access to much better everything because they're in an economically better situation, even though they're poor. So adequacy is also something that they focused on. So I have a note here about advocates. Our advocates now focus on adequacy funding, but this concept is subjective and elusive. What do they mean by that?
So I like to use the example, and I'm not trying to trash anyone's research or work on this. So I'm gonna boil this down to some real basic concept here. If you have a system where the state is providing enough money for everyone to get equal, again, let's just say that we're living in this world, right, where the state is providing enough money for everyone to be equal. And in that year, the local school district, the wealthy local school districts raise more money. They shift the goalpost. And so in order to keep up, you need to put more money into where your locals are going. And the next year, the competitive nature of school funding shifts the goalpost again. So anytime that you try to calculate what is adequacy, what are you basing it on? Are you basing it on standard outcomes, or are you basing it on the outcomes of the kids in those districts that consistently move the goalpost? If you're basing it on that, you're never going to come to an answer that's going to satisfy you because the number moves every single year. And so where we get to when we start to think like, well, that's like fruitless, and you're living in a constrained resource environment where you can't just tax to everyone to death, then what matters much more is where you put the incremental dollar. The equity of the system matters much more than how much you have in it. And I want to speak to this from my own experience because I know that that's a controversial statement. And one of the things that I've found very frustrating is that there are 2 or 3 states in the South that have had costing out studies done where they said, this is ta-da, your magic number that you need in order to educate a child. And it doesn't take into consideration things like labor market, competition, all of that sort of stuff that actually exists in the real world. And state legislators can't get there. So Mississippi is one of the highest effort states in the country. They're putting more of their tax dollars toward education than almost every other state in the US.
Really?
They literally cannot find more money than what they've got. I mean, realistically. And so if you can't get to this magic adequacy number, then what happens is there's always a scapegoat. And it's the money that is always the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
We can't get every kid to proficient because we didn't have enough money to do so. We can't hold on to quality teachers because we don't have enough money to do so. And so forget that our low income school districts are getting less money. If you just fully funded the formula, they would be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these become political recitations that happen every year that prevent us from shifting the system, no matter how much money is in it, to benefit the kids who need it the most. And that's where I really think that we need to continue to focus.
So much when I listen to it, you having this conversation, it feels like there needs to be a third party. So, and by third party, I mean this. These things get politicized so much that it becomes hard to talk about them in just on face value terms. Let's just have an on face value. Like, what's good for people? What's good? What's the good society here? Like, what's good for children? What's good for all of us? If we wanted to live in the ideal place, what would we spend on this? How would we prioritize these things? How would we talk about them when they get tough? Like when there's no kind of clear answer. So where's that third party of like kind of apolitical, smart people that can just look at these things for the public? This might be you, actually. Now I think about it as I'm saying it. This is kind of like a fair broker of like the discussion on these things with the premise, though, what kind of world do we want to live in? Like what kind of schools do we want for all kids? And I think it's the left and the right, the Republican and the Democrat, the kind of duopoly of thinking that really prevents us from having a good society conversation here. That might be oversimplifying. I wanted to go through all of these because there's like several more. I'm just going to quickly say, so we did the adequacy one. They also have one about outcomes for lower performing students requires making schools more efficient with existing funds, not allocating more funds. While funding gaps by race continue in a few states, overall funding is now equally generalized. That kind of goes to your first point, which is just, they're saying it's fixed and you're saying it's not fixed. Equalizing classroom resources like access to high quality teachers is more politically viable than going after the adequate funding stuff, which I kind of think they're saying what I said earlier. It's kind of a third rail to tell people you're going to take something from them, but almost everybody thinks teachers should be better. And then it says that increased funding's effectiveness, it diminishes. The returns from that diminish over time. So other policy improvements are needed to really impact things for disadvantaged kids. I want to shift from that, though. Those are the ones. Do any of those ones that you feel like compelled to address or attack? Because I do want to.
Diminishing returns is a real thing. Diminishing returns is a real thing. And we do need to recognize that there are some school districts, especially in the Northeast, that have more than enough money. They have more than enough. And I think that as long as we're willing as a society to say that some folks are just fine, then I think we can keep the conversation honest.
I think they made, which is pretty interesting for them, some policy suggestions, other improvements such as better healthcare or offering child tax credits. That might be more impactful, probably in those places you're saying, where they have plenty enough money. They've spent the money, but now they need to look at some other things. I want to shift to you because right now states are going on kind of like a school choice bonanza, and they are like, many states are passing these kind of coupons to go to schools that don't exist right now to give parents like money to do all kinds of just like wild things that I think is going to bite us in the butt like 10 years from now. Go to SeaWorld, here's a trampoline, here's a piano, just use public money for any of these things, which, I just want to keep saying this. If you were to take me back 10 years from today, go back 10 years and have a conversation with any Republican and tell them, hey, I want to start a program that is going to give families money for piano lessons and for tickets to Disneyland, they would have laughed you out of the room. That's like a welfare policy that they would have never supported. And here we are today in the upside down world. This thing is being pitched of kind of like this new welfare subsidy for families that want to do weird things with education. The proliferation of these ESA programs, they're not all the same. They have different kind of elements in them. But what do you have? Do you have concrete things to say about the financial repercussions of what can happen with those becoming so popular?
So first of all, I want to recognize that these programs have become popular because overall the system has been less responsive than families would like. And so I think that folks on the left who value keeping a strong public system in place need to consistently recognize that there is a reason why folks are trying to leave the public schools. That aside, it's fundamentally different to run after completely irresponsible policy in order to meet those ends. And regardless of what I believe about whether or not we should have a completely libertarian society of public, private, and charter choices, and everyone can go everywhere with their coupons, what I think that we would all agree in the middle, right, in the left to middle, is that you still need to have accountability. You still need to have some sort of regulation. You still need to have standards. You still need to have some things in place. Let's put that aside. That's how I get to the money. What we have right now is a system where arguably if every kid took one of the ESAs that are being offered in states that don't have capped programs, there would be zero people paying into the state's pension system. Zero. There would be zero money going into the state's pension system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So this is a system where in most states, we know it's underfunded almost everywhere. In most states, what they do is the pension system will assess school districts for money every year to pay into the fund. And it goes toward paying for their debt and for the current teacher obligations. The only people who have been paying that responsibly are local taxpayers. Every time we give the money to state legislators, they don't fully fund the pension system. And so if we take away the mechanism by which we are responsibly starting to pay down debt and keeping our obligations to the pension system, if we take that public school system away, or if we substantially downsize it, we end up in a place where we don't have a way for the local taxpayer to continue to pay into these things that were part of the social construct. And I want to say this because like the idea of a social construct here sounds super liberal until you start thinking about it as like a nuclear power plant. So we all got together and decided that we were going to build a nuclear power plant here in this community. And 2 years later, we realized that we could actually power everything off of windmills. And so is it responsible for us to just say, all right, well, we're just going to shut the power off to the nuclear power plant and hope that the core doesn't melt down? And if it does, hope that that's not going to seep into our groundwater? Because I can assure you that what's happening right now is that the inability to pay into the pension system is going to shut off the power to the nuclear power plant. And that's going to affect everyone's groundwater. And so there are things where normally fiscal conservatives would never allow for policymaking to occur where there are really big, outstanding questions about who's going to fund things that we've all agreed to, that we're walking away from now. And to me, that's the dichotomy of this weird kind of coalition that's come together to push these bills through that don't actually contemplate what we're going to do about some of those big things. They're certainly not made up of fiscal conservatives, or it's a bunch of fiscal conservatives that are abandoning that principle in order to bias another.
So I would challenge just a couple of things there. So first of all, I don't think that these programs come out of what parents want. I think they come out of, they're being done by fiat. I think they're coming out of like a man-made laboratory in DC on M Street that is kicking these things out and then funding it very heavily and threatening people that if they don't pass it, it will be the end of their career. So I'm just going to speak honestly about these things. I'll never lie to the public. This is artificial. These things are not being passed because all of a sudden one year parents decided that they wanted something totally different. It's being passed everywhere because there's like $100 million right now at stake to threaten lawmakers who won't pass it. And even some Republicans are pushing back on that. It has not been easy to pass in some places in red states. Look at Texas. Texas has had to call their Republicans back like 4 or 5 times and still didn't get it across the finish line. Still not getting it. And that has to be the example with everybody across the country should pay attention to that. You have to ask yourself, well, why wouldn't they just pass that if it's so kind of popular and they run everything? So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, and this is all coming out of my ex-libertarian knowledge base that I guess I have. The other thing is like, you couldn't have cornered me a couple of years on the idea of what's going to happen to the regular system if we just let everybody take coupons and atomize everybody and they go everywhere. I would have just said, well, that is what it is. I mean, the system will need to compete. Or what's different about the way I look at this now is, number one, the largest school choice program ever was white flight. So if you look at what white flight did when people made their own decisions, and they all went their own way, what it did to Detroit is that it left a whole bunch of people in a crumbling system that didn't have a lot of choice or whatever. So that was the biggest choice program ever. Hey, parents want something different. It's called the suburbs. So when 120,000 of them leave the Detroit public schools, there is a systemic impact of what happens to the people who stay in Detroit, like those kids. So when you look at a state like Arizona or Iowa, where 80% of the people who applied for these coupons were people that had never been in the public schools, 80%. So if you have if this is a public money to private school subsidy of people who weren't even in the system anymore, I don't even know how that's fair to the regular system. That is taking money out of the regular system and putting it in a place it wasn't before. It's not just parents walking out and the money following the kid. It's parents who were never here. It's like kids that were never in the district. I was stunned by that number. Like that number, 80%, and people can fact check me on the exact number. I think Arizona is a little different than Iowa. It was a lot of people. It was the majority. It was the majority that had never been in public school that now are getting this money that's meant for public school kids. And when I think about the kids left behind, all that means is now they have less money for their principals, for their facilities, for their books. They just have less money because now they have to subsidize the private schooling of people that were never in the pool in the first place. I feel like that was my soapbox moment. But
so there is a self-interest argument to this, though. What I wonder is, when do you get to a point where folks have so separated themselves from the system and they're getting the financial incentive to separate themselves from the system that they stop paying for the system that's serving the most vulnerable kids? Like, are we really going to have a bunch of wealthy folks who continue to raise their local property taxes to serve what could become the public school of last resort, right? The school of last resort. And what I would argue is, when you're no longer invested in the public system, you are not going to continue to pay for it. And so I think that it gets even worse, because in your Detroit example, the people aren't leaving. The people are staying. The kids are just leaving, right? So how long will wealthy Detroiters stick around and continue to pay for that public school system that they're not invested in, and the kids that are going there, frankly, don't look like theirs? That's the next generation question that we need to be asking. And in fact, just to plug EdFund, We've got an RFP out right now for economists to start inquiring about some of these next gen questions. And that is one. At what point, what is the critical mass of students that you have to have enrolled in a public system for the public community to continue to vote up taxes?
I love that question. And I love you just hit the thing on the head that this is why I like smart people. What are the think ahead a little bit. What are the next gen questions to ask? Because I think we're so short sighted sometimes. When I say I think 10 years from now we're going to be in a world of hurt for some of the decisions we're making today, I really believe that. I really believe that this kind of wild west of stuff is going to come back to haunt us in terms of outcomes, in terms of finances, in terms of the system that we have the majority of our kids in. And then the pendulum will swing the other way because, like, we're so irresponsible now that there will have to be a responsibility movement in the future because it'll just have to, so things don't crumble. I love that you came on today and that you came with us today. And I want you to give people any type of insight on how, number one, they can find you, and number two, they can follow up with anything that you have. I know you have a report on your website, but anything else that you would want them to pay attention to.
So stay tuned because we're going to be doing a big campaign this year on concentrated poverty, where the research is pretty settled on the matter, and we want to translate that into policy for advocates. So we're excited about that. So stay tuned. And I can be found, I'm at Rebecca Sibilia on everything. And our email is first name at ed-fund.org. Website is ed-fund.org. And I'm just super excited that you gave me the opportunity to kind of come have a great conversation and throw a couple of promotions in for the new gig.
Well, listen, I think that this is what's going to make the difference in the United States is good conversation with smart people who are informed so that the rest of us actually can learn in the process. I think we talk about schools as if learning just happens in classrooms. Learning is lifelong. It happens in all the things that we do. We are always learning. And that's why this is called Always Learning, because we really are always learning. And my hope for the country is that we learn so much more than we know right now. Because I think so much of our problem is based on the fact of what we don't know. So let's keep having these conversations, keep talking. For people listening, if you like this show and you like this conversation, please share it and subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts. And we will always try to keep bringing you interesting people who have interesting things to say and are pretty smart about it. Rebecca, I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.